Hello, I'm Joni and I'm mother of the bride. My website is called I'mMotherOfTheBride.com, and on there I talk about everything about weddings from the point of view of the mother. So what to wear, the new rules, how people do things these days, and also what about having a home wedding. So this is part of the home wedding series, this video. I'm going to talk about how to calculate the size of marquee or wedding tent to rent if you're thinking of having the wedding at home. The first thing you have to decide is how many guests. So think a little bit about how people will be arranged for the seating. And then also think about what other areas, apart from the meal, do you need in your tent? Are you going to have a DJ? Will there be a buffet or will there be waiters? Will those waiters need somewhere to serve from? Will you be having a dance floor or will that go outside? What about smokers? So all of these things have to be taken into account when you decide how large you want your tent to be. The other thing is to decide what sort of tent. Now, you can look at all the different tents and set your heart on one, but if they're not available locally to rent, you're probably going to pay far too much. So only decide on the tent when you see what's available locally. The most popular tent for garden or backyard weddings is definitely the frame tent. Now we all know what they're like. The most important thing about them is they have square or rectangular sides and they have metal poles holding those sides up. What people like about them is that you can put them right up against another building or another tent. There are no externals to the tent, so the size of the tent is the size of the place that you need to install them. And also they can be installed on most surfaces as long as they're flat. What people aren't so keen on, of course, is that they look quite modern. Altogether, it's not a very traditional tent, but it really works well for a large crowd. So the second type of tent that I'm going to talk about capacity is a more traditional tent. In the UK we call it a traditional marquee. In the States, a pole tent or a push-pole tent. And these sometimes have beautiful shapes, especially if they go up into a point on the top of the roof. They're usually made of either canvas or PVC to look like canvas. And again, they can have open sides, they can have doors, they can have windows, and so on. People love these because they're traditional. They look very pretty. Think of a village fete, for example. But there are negatives. One of the negatives is that the size of the tent is smaller than the size you need to actually erect them. And that's because it's stabilised by long, thin guy ropes which have to go into the ground at the sides. So you have to allow quite a perimeter of free space around the tent. And also having those guy ropes can be slightly worrying if you've got very young children who are running free. The other thing about push-pole tents is, of course, they have poles. That's how the ceiling or the roof is held up, and those are internal. So you don't get quite as much space for the same capacity as with a frame tent. But they are beautiful and certainly worth thinking about. The biggest negative, perhaps, is that they can't sit on concrete or your driveway or your patio. They have to sit on grass because those guy ropes have to be sunk into the grass. They have to be pushed into the grass. And then there are a couple of other types of tent that you might find locally. One of them is a yurt, and this has become very popular over the last 5 to 10 years. They're usually circular, which means they can't go right up against another building or your house and so on. But you want people to be able to see them from the outside as well, and that's half their beauty. They've often got very good eco-credentials, being made of things like wood and canvas. And the decor inside is often the most important feature of a yacht. And people who are renting out yachts will go to very great lengths to make sure that the internal decor is really beautiful. So when you're thinking about a yacht, remember that you want to check out what's going to go inside as well, and will that suit the theme of your wedding. And then finally, perhaps, we've got teepees, so the traditional Native American style tent. These aren't as big as the other tents, so you'll probably need more than one, but they are fun. They perhaps look better in a field rather than in a garden, but they're a lot of fun, they're very young, and a bit like the yacht, one of the positives is, you know, your daughter, she's doing her own thing. There's a new type of tent that's come onto the scene in the last 20 years, and that's the stretch tent, and they are doing wonderful business with things like launch parties and external areas for lovely restaurants and so on. So you will certainly have seen these around. They can be any size, they can be any colour. They can have sides, but they're usually open to the elements, so probably not for an autumn wedding in somewhere like Britain. But if you know it's going to be sunny, it's a beautiful type of tent and lovely organic shapes, but not traditional. So how big, whatever tent you have, how big does it have to be? So I've looked at the figures, and here we go. So if we look at 100 guests, 100 seated guests for a meal, for a frame tent, you're looking at about 1,000 square feet for the seating. And in metric, that's about 93 square metres you need. But on top of that, if you're looking for a dance floor, add on about another 240 or so square feet. That's about another 22 square metres. If you're going to have a bar, you're going to need about 100 square feet for that, or around 9 or 10 square metres. And if you've got a DJ, he'll need somewhere to work from, so add 40 square feet minimum for him or her. Think 4 or 5 square metres. And then in total, for quite a simple sort of a wedding, you're looking at about 1,400 square feet, or about 130 square metres. But remember some extras. Waiting stations if you're using waiters, catering areas, lounge areas, a band area if you're not just having a DJ, a cake table, presents table. Think about all of the extras that you really want, how many of them can go outside and how many of them might have to come inside if it's poor weather, before you decide exactly on the size of tent you want. So for a frame tent, typically a backyard wedding has a frame tent of 30 by 40 foot. That comes out at 1,200 square feet. And if we're talking metric, 9 metres by 12 metres, that's 110 square metres. This will seat about 100 or 120 guests, but it does mean that a lot of those other extra areas will have to be outside. So what about the size of a pole tent? Well, for 100 guests, you're talking about the same sort of size. The only difference, as I mentioned, is remember it can't go right up against the house because of its external shape, and you need space for the guy ropes, and it's got to go on grass. What size for a yacht? So the recommended size for 100 seated guests is 44 foot length or 14 metres length. Guests are usually seated on wooden benches with wooden tables in front of them, long wooden tables. Some specialist companies do have orangery style yachts, and you may be able to get 100 in that yacht measuring 30 by 50 feet or 9 by 15 metres. Again, just think about the decor and the way people are sitting. Is that the way you want it? And then what about teepees? Well, the biggest teepee I could find was 110 foot or about 10 metres. and that'll take a maximum of 80 seated guests. So you'll probably have to hire 2 teepees if you've got 100 people. But remember, teepees can be linked together. Really, your imagination and your creativity has to come into play if you're going to have teepees. And then what about a stretch tent? For 100 seated guests, the stretch tent that you need will normally be 40 by 60 foot or 12 by 18 metres. And this will allow for just about the whole thing. 100 seated guests, place for the DJ, place for the bar, possibly a buffet and a dance floor. If you want to see more details about this and about the types of tents and so on, please go to my website, I'mMotherOfTheBride.com. If you like this video and you want to hear about others, please subscribe. And meanwhile, all I've got left to say is have a wonderful day with your daughter, and I hope the sun shines upon you.